was standing down there and I went to sit down and oh, I left my Bible up there again. I just found my Bible this morning after having lost it for a week. And, I could have just left it. All right, we're going to be in Nehemiah, chapter 13. Nehemiah chapter 13. And in this part of Nehemiah, there's some things that are sort of coming to conclusion in the book. Last week we talked about the time of repentance and confession that the Israelites had after they were seeking to set some things right. They had a day where they came together in sackcloth and ashes, and it was a day of repentance and a day of confession, and they spent the first quarter of the whole day in confession, and then they spent another quarter of the day in prayer, and then there's this long prayer that is recorded there that the people make, basically confessing their sins and giving glory to God, and acknowledging that He was faithful and that they were the ones who were unfaithful and that they rebelled against God. Because of that, they suffered, and that God was now restoring them, and they were asking God to give them what they needed in order to continue to be faithful to Him. And they'd also made a pact, and that they realized that there were certain things that caused their captivity in Babylon, and that they needed to do something about these things, and that they came up with a plan, and they actually put that plan into writing, and that there were certain things that they were going to do in order to stay on track and be faithful to God, so that they would not end up in the same situation that they were because of the sins of their forefathers. And so they actually says they put this into writing, and certain important people signed it. And I guess you could think of it sort of like a New Year's resolution that they were making. And they come to this time where they realize they have to set some things right, and they have to change some things, get some things going in a new direction, so that they could, number one, continue to show honor to the holy name of God, but number two, that they would not suffer the consequences from rebelling against God and neglecting the name and the work of God. And so then they do that, and then there's, in chapters 12, there's a story about this great procession that they have, where they get up on the wall that they were building. They kind of come around the city from two sides in this procession, this choral, and they singing the praises of God. And so there's a lot of enthusiasm. There's a lot of, they're having really, their hearts are filled with gratitude, and they have grandiose things in mind, and they're very dedicated to doing the right things and to serving God and fulfilling His law and honoring His holy name. And then we come to chapter 13, and we see that there's a story here about how these things were set into place, that the temple was squared away. People were put in their proper roles so that they could do the sacrifices, so the temple could be taken care of, so the tithes could be brought in, the priests be provided for. They even put the singers, Mike talked about Asaph and the singers, the Levites who were there, they put those people back into service and provided for them so that the worship of the Lord could take place on a regular basis and not be neglected. And so in chapter 13, though, we read about there's a time where Nehemiah has to return to the king of Persia. Remember, Nehemiah was a cupbearer to the king, and his service was not over. The king allowed him to go to Jerusalem for a certain time in order to help get things back on track there. But there was a time where he had to go back. But he went back, it says, and then he served the king for a while, King Artaxerxes. But then it says in chapter 13, verse 6, while all this was going on, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I returned to the king. And sometime later I asked permission and came back to Jerusalem. So he came back to Jerusalem after this. And when I came back to Jerusalem, here I learned about the evil thing Eliashib had done, providing Tobiah a room in the courts of the house of God. And so here, while Nehemiah was gone, they cleaned out a room in the temple that was dedicated to the service of the Lord, and certain things were supposed to be there. and they let this guy, Tobiah, move in, who didn't belong there. It's just that he knew so-and-so and had a friend and had connections, so they provided him with a room at the temple in the house of God. Well, Nehemiah comes back and says, I was greatly displeased. And you can imagine, having gone through all this work, all this turmoil, all the risk, all the travail, to set all these things right and get the people of God squared away and everything's going in the right direction, that you leave going back thinking that you've restored something, only to return a little while later to find out everything's going backwards. I was greatly displeased, and I threw all Tobiah's household goods out of the room. So he comes back and sees this guy has moved into the temple. Well, he doesn't think, I'm going to have to set up a meeting with Tobiah and talk to him about this. No, this guy's stuff does not belong in the temple. So he starts tossing his household goods out of the temple because they don't belong there. This is the house of God. This is not a hotel or a Motel 6 or a rental property. This is the house of God. It does not belong there. And he says, So I threw all Tobiah's household goods out of the room. I gave orders to purify the rooms, and then I put back into them the equipment of the house of God, with the grain offerings and the incense. You see, there were things that belonged here. This was a storeroom for the equipment that was used in the worship of the Lord. And they thought, well, yeah, we don't need this stuff in here. We'll just move this stuff out of here, and we'll let this Tobiah dude move in here. So you can see, well, maybe it's not a big deal if the stuff is stored over here rather than being here. That's not the point. The point is this room belongs to the service of Yahweh. That's the point. This guy's household stuff does not belong here, so he threw it out. I also learned that the portions assigned to the Levites had not been given to them. These are the tithes and the offerings that are supposed to be given to the temple by the people. This is one of the very reasons why they were put into captivity in Babylon in the first place. This is also one of the very reasons why, when they returned from Babylon to the land, that it didn't go well. Because you can read in the prophet Haggai, he says to the people, why are you living in paneled houses when the house of God lies in ruins? You see, they were taking care of their own business, but not taking care of God's business. And so now they're going backwards again. I also learned that the portions assigned to the Levites had not been given to them, and that all the Levites and singers responsible for the service had gone back to their fields. Well, these guys weren't being provided for, so they were not doing the services in the temple like they were supposed to be, because they had to eat. So they went back to the fields to work, because they had to provide for themselves and their families. So they couldn't do the work in the temple that they were assigned to do. So Nehemiah says, I rebuked the officials and asked them, why is the house of God neglected? Right? He comes back and finds out that the worship is not going on in the house of God. The temple of the Lord is basically shut down. Why? Why? Tell me, why is the house of God neglected above all things? Why is this not happening? Then I called them together and I stationed them at their posts. So Nehemiah's back. Nehemiah's back, and come hell or high water, he is going to make sure that God is being praised in the temple. So he goes out to the fields probably and finds these guys and says, hey, you need to get back to your business in the temple. And I could hear him, well, I got crops in the fields. I've got work to do. Well, why should the house of God be neglected? It's almost a rhetorical question. All Judah brought the tithes of the grain, the new wine, the oil into the storerooms. And I put Shelemiah, the priest, Zadok the scribe, and a Levite named Pedaiah in charge of the storerooms, and made Hanan, son of Zechar, and son of Mattaniah, their assistant, because these men were considered trustworthy. They were made responsible for distributing the supplies to their brothers. Remember me for this, O my God, and do not blot out what I have so faithfully done for the house of my God and its services. And that's not all. In those days I saw men in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in grain and loading it on donkeys, together with wine, grapes, figs, and all other kinds of loads. And they were bringing all this into Jerusalem on the Sabbath. Therefore, I warned them against selling food on that day. Men from Tyre who lived in Jerusalem were bringing in fish and all kinds of merchandise and selling them in Jerusalem on the Sabbath to the people of Judah. I rebuked the nobles of Judah, and I said to them, what is this wicked thing you are doing, desecrating the Sabbath day? Didn't your forefathers do the same thing, so that God brought all this calamity upon us and upon this city? Now you are stirring up more wrath against Israel by desecrating the Sabbath. And when the evening shadows fell on the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I ordered the doors to be shut and not opened until the Sabbath was over. I stationed some of my own men at the gates so that no load could be brought in on the Sabbath day. Once or twice the merchants and sellers of all kinds of goods spent the night outside Jerusalem, but I warned them and said, why do you spend the night by the wall? If you do this again, I will lay hands on you. This is like saying, if you do this again, I'm about to do, I'm going to do something and you're not going to like it. This is a threat, physical violence against these guys. I couldn't think of any appropriate threats, so nothing. What's that? Yeah, he's going to drop them. That's right. He says, so if you do this again, I will lay hands on you. And from that time on, they no longer came on the Sabbath. Then I commanded the Levites to purify themselves and go and guard the gates in order to keep the Sabbath on the holy day. See, these are the Levites. These are the people who were set apart for this task. They were not fulfilling their role and their calling as God's people and doing what they were meant to do, so that the day of the Lord was desecrated. And sometimes we think, well, it's just a day. And my God, can we imagine if you didn't show up at church, can you imagine somebody coming to your house and grabbing you by the scruff of the neck and throwing you out the door and kicking you in the pants all the way to the church building? Can you imagine somebody doing that? We think of that, that'd be ridiculous, right? We'd call the police. But you know what the penalty for breaking the Sabbath was in the law of Moses? Yeah. It was death. That's right. The Sabbath day was holy. This is the Lord's day. And when you desecrate the Lord's day, you desecrate the name of God. And when you desecrate the name of God, you are punished by death. Because you are desecrating the holy name and character of God. See? So Nehemiah wasn't even really going as far as he probably should have. And really the seriousness of all this. But you can see in just a short time that the people here had made all these reforms and they were setting all things right and worshiping God and trying to avoid the evils that had brought the calamity upon them, that landed them in Babylon for 70 years and that was causing them so much trouble when they returned. So the prophets would say, consider carefully your ways. You plant but you don't have a harvest. You work but you have no money. All these things. He says, give careful thought to your ways about these things, what the prophet said to them. And so they were doing that. And they were trying to set things right, and things were going better for them. But we're so easily turned, right? People are so easily turned away from holiness, and so easily turned away from what is right, and so easily turned away from the relationship that we have with God. I can't imagine if there was ever a time for God's people to set things right and keep it rolling, this was it. But nonetheless, in just a few short years, in Nehemiah's absence, and we really don't even know how long he was gone, but it apparently wasn't that long. When you go and look at the historical records and you start adding up the years, it was a pretty short time he was gone. But nonetheless, in that period of time, the people of God went backwards. In fact, in that period of time, it wasn't just that the people of God went backwards, but the people of God really turned their backs on the living God and desecrated his holy name and his holy temple and what they were doing. And so, I think the lesson from this, at least one lesson, there's a lot of lessons, but the holy people of God can never let down their guard against evil and complacency. Never. The holy people of God can never let down their guard against evil and complacency. Evil permeates everything in this world like a stench. It really does. You know, when you stop and think about it, evil is just, it's everywhere. It's in everything you can imagine. There's nothing which is innocent. There's nothing that is not tainted by the curse of sin and the stench of evil upon it, so that we can just take it lightly and allow these things to creep in and engage in them without giving careful thought to what we are doing. We always have to be on guard against these things, because evil, it just permeates everything in this world. It's like a stench. It's like a, I was watching a thing yesterday about these guys who were fighting in Okinawa in World War II, and he was describing the battlefield. And he was saying, you know, the battlefield, you watch battlefield movies, and even the show we were watching was trying to depict what was going on in Okinawa, you know, and they can theatrically depict the battle with the Japanese coming this way, the Americans coming this way, and the tanks and the explosions and the bullets and all this stuff, and they can try to reproduce what it was like. And he says, yeah, you can reproduce that in the movie. He says, the one thing you can't reproduce is the stench from dead bodies. You know, when you've got, in Okinawa, there were 100,000, over 100,000 Japanese soldiers alone which were killed, and a quarter of the population of Okinawa was killed. Not to mention 12,000 dead bodies from Americans, and all the wounded, and all the blood laying everywhere. And then you combine that with the stench of sweat, right? BO, right? The other thing is, you know, just because you're on the battlefield doesn't mean you don't have to go to the bathroom, right? That's got to go somewhere too. And then you've got blood and everything else everywhere, blood, guts laying everywhere. It's just, it's disgusting. You know, it doesn't go anywhere. It's there, and it permeates everything, and you can't get away from it. So, I think that's what evil is like too. You know, we're on this battlefield, so to speak, for our lives, and the stench of death, it's everywhere. It's kind of like if you, I was thinking of one of these things that Jackson talks a lot about when certain times you have experiences in your life you don't forget. Well, I have a couple storage units down here in the Hollow that are owned by the city of Randler. I have a couple storage units down there, and Jackson calls them the sneaky garages. You know, because you go down there and it's just, oh man, it must be the mill or something down there. But it's just, there's a stench. You know, and it's so bad that when you get out of your car, you want to just get whatever you can get and get away from it. Right? But evil is this way. Evil is just, it's everywhere. You know, and we can do all the hard work of reform and all the hard work of religion and be and trying to do all things right and trying to be holy, trying to be compassionate, trying to set ourselves up so that we are going in the right direction, trying to be fruitful for the Lord, and doing all these things. And in an instant, every good thing that we have can dissipate. Because evil is there, and it's like water. When your water is surrounding your house, you know, if you have a foundation that's in the ground of your house, and the water is coming up through the ground, and the water is starting to surround your foundation, it just finds a crack. It's going to find, and the pressure of that water pushing on the foundation is going to find a crack. And once it finds that crack, it's almost impossible to stop it. It's almost impossible to stop it from coming in. And this is how evil is in our lives. And so we have to be diligent as God's people. We can never let down our guard against evil and complacency. And I think that's really what happens is when we get complacent about our relationship with God, we get complacent about evil, is when it's able to creep into our lives and take hold and turn us and really destroy us. Which is why we always have to be on our guard. And that's what you see here. I think this story about the wall and the gates here in Nehemiah is kind of almost metaphorical, where you have this wall that surrounds Jerusalem that separates the people of God from the outside. And the people sort of neglected that. The Levites, who were supposed to guard the gates and who were supposed to keep things from happening on the Sabbath like they were supposed to, neglected their duty. They became complacent about it. And because they were complacent, then God's Sabbath was desecrated. All these things. So it's important for us that we never let down our guard. But more important than that, it's not just that we don't let down our guard, but whatever it is that we have been called to do, we have to do. there's no such thing as just being a Christian who has nothing to do for the Lord. The Lord calls us to serve, right? Just as we talked about in the Lord's Supper. That when we take this supper and we partake and we participate in the meal, what we're saying is that I'm in. That I'm in. I'm in for all the blessings, but I'm also in for the service. And that we should not be seeking our own good, but the good of others. And that's what it means to live as one of God's holy people. And that one of the interesting things I thought about the psalm that Mike read earlier is when one of the things that lures us away, when it talks about the arrogance of the wicked. And you see the pride of the wicked and all the things that they have and the lifestyle of that lures us away from serving the living God. So that we can satisfy ourselves first. And so we have to be careful. We have to set up this wall on our lives. We have to guard our gates and make sure that we are about the business that God has called us to, which is serving Him, and not just trying to satisfy our own desires. And it's very easy to get caught into this trap because we live in such a culture which is permeated by evil. It's all around us. It's everywhere. And we can easily become complacent, and we can be swept away in the current of our culture so easily, and I think a lot of times not even knowing it, unknowingly, so that before we know it, in the blink of an eye, that our lives are destroyed, our families are destroyed, our church is destroyed, because we neglected the house of God. Which is what Nehemiah said to the people there. Well, how can you neglect the house of God? Why do you neglect the house of God? That's for us, what is the house of God for us? Well, the house of God it's us. It's the people. Okay? It's myself. That as a Christian, I'm indwelt by the Holy Spirit of God, and I cannot neglect the house of God. And when we neglect the house of God, that's when evil comes in, God's holy name is desecrated. And so we need to be about the business that God has given to us and not neglect that, and to be focused on doing the things that God has for us to do. And I know sometimes when we talk about these kind of things, it's, I'm up here, I'm speaking in generalities in many ways. Part of it is because I don't know what's going on in every single person's life. I will guarantee you that I know that in every single person's life that evil is trying to wiggle its way in. I know that. I don't know how I don't know how that is happening to you, but I know it's happening. I know it's happening. I know it's happening to you because I know it's happening to me. Right? And I know that if we don't take that seriously, and then we are complacent about it, then we drift off, and bad things happen to us, and we suffer consequences. And it's not just me who's suffering consequences, but it's all of God's people who suffer consequences. And it's not just me who suffers a consequence, but it's God's name which is desecrated because of it. And when God's name is desecrated, what happens is judgment. That we suffer the judgment of God. And we shouldn't think that that won't happen to us. We shouldn't think that that won't happen to us. We're Christians, and we believe in grace, and we know that we are saved by the grace of God, and God works with us by grace. But at the same time, God is holy and just, and God will not allow His name just to be desecrated. He's going to defend His holy name. And that's why Paul would even say to the Corinthians that the reason that some of you have died and fallen asleep is because you have been immoral. And that you have not taken seriously